Great. So thanks everyone for joining us. I'm really honored to have been invited to moderate this conversation about what I think is an extremely exciting book. And so the way I think we're going to run this for the next about 40 minutes is I'm going to talk very little. I'm just going to give prompts and ask some general questions about the book to allow the authors to really dig into the book, their motivations for the book, the critiques they offer in the book, and also the book's very unique style. And we'll get to that in a second. But first off, this is an extremely broad question, but I mean, I think it's crucial with a book, especially a book like this. What was your motivation for writing the book? What does Half-Earth Socialism do that you thought either wasn't being done by contemporary text on environmental politics and socialism and eco-socialism, or how does it engage in the sort of broader conversation about how we build a more sustainable, greener world?
Am I unmuted? That's fine, right? Yeah, okay. So if I could start with that, I think we were trying to work through questions that were interesting us. And I think, Toni Morrison, I believe, once said that you write the books that you want to read that don't exist. So I think we were looking for something that would really grapple with, first of all, I guess, thinking about what socialism is, right? Is a socialism just like a Keynesian kind of throwback to like the 60s, or is it command style economies and the Soviet Union, or what is it? Or is it just some kind of like utopian abundance and then, some kind of anarchy or anarchist, utopia? What exactly is it? So we want to work through that. And then the other thing we wanted to think about was how do you deal with the environmental crisis? And we really wanted to talk about all facets of the environmental crisis, from new pandemics to extinction to various kinds of chemical cycles being disrupted, and to climate change as well. So we wanted to understand those two things, I think. And then by writing the book, we could better understand those points for ourselves, and then hopefully we could bring along readers to join us.
Yeah, I think I'll just add on to that Troy is a historian and I'm a scientist. So we also, I think, both were reacting to maybe dissatisfactions that we had in the existing environmental literature, a lack of a coherent picture uniting things like biodiversity loss and climate and zoonotic disease and all these things. And we also wanted to posit solutions rather than writing a book of critique with a last chapter that maybe has unsatisfying answers at the end. So it was our way of like focusing on positive ideas, like what would it look like to solve the environmental crisis in its totality, bracketing maybe immediate political feasibility. So it's a utopian book. We both love utopian novels, utopian fiction, utopian socialism. So it's utopian in that sense, but it's very practical and grounded in science in a way that we found to be grounding and satisfying intellectually. So it's responding to dissatisfactions. And as Troy said, it's the book we wanted to read.
So as you said, the book is quite pragmatic. I mean, in a sense, it's a manifesto. It's a manifesto with an extremely daring title, Half-Earth Socialism, of course, referring to the ideas circulating in some parts of biology, environmental politics, earth science, that half the earth should be set aside for sort of non-human species and ecologies to flourish. You pair that with socialism and you've got a very strong provocation. I have a lot of questions about the particulars of how you approach this book, and specifically your ideas of planning and what it entails. Now, your book is pretty clear that there's not one solution, that there's sort of like a range of solutions on which people should draw to create this thing you call half-earth socialism. But there's also some basic contours of what this would look like and would not look like. So before we get into details, I'd like you to describe for our viewers, our listeners, what a half-earth socialist planet looks like, because this really is a global project. So, and if it doesn't look like one thing, what are the contours of how we build this thing that you're positing, which you're calling Half-Earth Socialism?
Yeah. So, well, one of the points we make in the book is that we should be debating about our future as a whole, as in like addressing the environmental crisis will require sacrifices in the global north, like in the US, and those sacrifices, we kind of outline what we think would be reasonable, like giving up meat is one thing that's really, really helpful in addressing the environmental crisis because it frees up a lot of land for rewilding and for, protections against zoonotic spillover, that sort of thing. But we think that those sorts of sacrifices have to be kind of offered in a whole picture, a kind of a whole slate, a vision of the future, a blueprint for the future, so that those trade-offs kind of are, seen as going somewhere, right? That's sort of this idea of socialist democracy that we'll probably get into a little later. So I won't talk about it too much right now. Instead, so you have this vision of what things you can give up and what things you get in return. So rather than having a deteriorating biosphere, which we might try and fix up with the duct tape of like solar geoengineering, where we try and artificially change the Earth's temperature, which looks increasingly likely as a climate solution. You can give up things like meat. You can do a renewable energy transition. You can, enact some energy quotas to make sure that we're not extracting too much for our renewable energy system or turning too much land over to our new energy system. So those sacrifices are made to kind of protect the biosphere. And Troy, I don't know if you have anything you wanted to add on here, a little more specific.
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think so. This book is building upon an article I wrote a few years ago, and that really was saying that land use is an important way of thinking about several different environmental problems. And these things are not only related to each other, but they compete with each other sometimes as well. So we can use land to sequester carbon, or we can use land to have more nature preserves to protect species, or we can try to also have land to prevent new diseases from emerging, because deforestation is a big problem for that. So we can, and then we have to worry about land in terms of having enough space for biofuels or renewable energy as well. So that was it. But then, the article I wrote didn't have a name for what I was proposing, right? So with Half-Earth Socialism, what we're trying to do is to do with that title is to say, first of all, we should care about more environmental problems than just climate. Climate's very important, but we should also worry about the biodiversity problem. And then the thing is, if we actually can achieve a utopian goal as grand as the Half-Earth, of actually setting aside half of the world in nature preserves, and that's much higher than it is now. I mean, now it's only around 10 to 15%, so to increase it by 3 or 5-fold would be a huge achievement and would help us achieve other goals, right? And then also with that name, Half-Earth Socialism, we're challenging conservationists and environmentalists to think about socialism. So this is kind of what we're getting at with this title, and because we want to include a lot of other people in this project and to think more broadly about how their goals and their politics relate to a broader coalition. So you're asking what would it look like to have a half-Earth, and you need to think about ways to free up land. So as Drew was saying, veganism is important because if you don't have a large animal husbandry industry, you suddenly have billions of hectares available that you can use for renewable energy, but also for nature preserves. And then we want to transition to renewable energy. We need to have energy quotas so we don't take up too much space in terms of plantations for biofuels or for other things. But as Drew's saying, once you begin to think about this land problem, you have to find building blocks to have space for everything you want. And if you try to cheat by having different kinds of energy that don't rely on energy flows, but energy stocks, such as nuclear or fossil fuels, then you're dealing with other problems. So what we're trying to say is we want people to think in total terms of what kind of society we want to live in. And the land problem is a good way of doing that.
So to jump back a step before we can move forward, of course, it's I mean, I hesitate to say that it's a consensus, but among some of us, there's a bit of a consensus that it is very much the sort of modern iteration of capitalism that is at the root of so many of these interwoven environmental crises. So of course, anthropogenic social change, but also the extinction crisis, the biodiversity crisis, and so on. But in your book, you don't so much ascribe the problem to capitalism sui generis, but specifically to neoliberal capitalism, as you do at the start of your book in the introduction, or so it seemed to me. And then you also, and the flip side of this is that you seem to suggest that a lot of really popular current environmental solutions, so be it carbon capture, be it solar geoengineering, be it this sort of turn to nuclear or perhaps other high-tech climate solutions, are themselves, in a sense, a symptom of this neoliberal capitalism now turning its eyes to finding solutions to the environmental crisis. And of course, you cast your project in distinction to this. So I was wondering if you could talk about, well, first, if you could define what you mean by neoliberal capitalism and how it's linked to the current environmental crisis. Explain why it's so noxious for the planet and the humans and the animals who inhabit it. And then also explain why and how it rears its head, why do you see it as being so prevalent in modern environmentalism?
What we're trying to do with the book is that we are saying definitely neoliberalism is an important ideology. We have to take it seriously. I think and we take it seriously to better understand it and to criticize it and to defeat it. And I'm a Marxist, and I think a lot of Marxists, they think that it doesn't matter what the ideology of the ruling class is because capitalists will act the way they're going to act anyways. They want to make money, so who cares what their ideas are at some level, right? And I think that's a mistake because neoliberals have been very effective at organizing themselves. So that's why we engage, and they have some good critiques of socialism, and we have to and also understand what their plan is for the future, right? How do they plan to deal with the environmental crisis? So these are all the things that we're doing when we're talking about neoliberalism. But the book engages with neoliberalism, but it also says capitalism has a certain dynamic, what Marx calls the automatic subject, where capital is not a real tangible thing, but it is a social force that emerges from relationships between people, especially the competition between capitalists, and that forces them to increase productivity and to go and earn at the going rate of profit. And this will drive economic growth, and usually productivity means you're taking more resources per hour worked, right? So this will lead to the commodification of the world as like the end point. And so we're not saying that neoliberal capitalism is the only problem. I mean, capitalism has existed for a long time and caused environmental crises for a long time. And if we have a different kind, if we merge into some kind of fascist capitalism, which seems more likely each coming year, then it will still have lots of problems, and we have to deal with that. But we're trying to say we're trying to engage with neoliberalism to learn from them in some ways, because they have been effective at coming up with basically a political ideology that can be useful for us as we're trying to develop our own political ideology. So there's that. And then I suppose your other question, and you basically asked three questions. I'm trying to deal with them all very quickly, but I'm happy to go more into what do neoliberals want to do, right? And what is neoliberalism, perhaps? Maybe people are curious about that. But I'll put that aside for a second and say what's going on with the environmental movement. So, what happened was basically in the 1960s and 70s, you have a strong Malthusian component to much of the environmental movement, not the whole environmental movement. I mean, there are exceptions, like Barry Commoner, for instance. who is much more critical of this Malthusianism. But this idea that population growth is the problem, and therefore, and also being worried about scarcity of natural resources. So that's why you had the limits to growth as a big talking point in the 70s, it's a huge bestseller and all that. And the idea was dealing with some kind of controls on population and on resource extraction. And then that basically hits a wall by the 80s. The environmental movement's not doing very well. And there's a real backlash from the right. And they eventually are co-opted in lots of ways by neoliberals. And things like cap and trade, for instance, is an example of a neoliberal policy being adopted by the environmental movement. So what I actually research, for my PhD and now for my next book is neoliberal environmental thought, and I get into the origins of cap and trade and all that. And so these things are what neoliberals are trying to do, where they want to create markets for, let's say, biodiversity loss, or for the destruction of streams, or restoring wetlands and so forth, or climate, for instance. You can cap and trade program from anything. And then they don't really work very well. We can get into why. And then in the long term, they want entrepreneurs to fix problems through geoengineering. So when we're criticizing other environmental solutions, such as nuclear or bioenergy and carbon sequestration, which maybe Drew wants to talk about, those things are not really neoliberal per se, right? So what we're saying is that these environmentalists and these scientists are offering their own solutions, and they're at this point very timid, I would say, politically, where they have learned the lesson of the 60s and 70s, they think, and that is you can't ask people to make major changes, right? And also you can't, or you shouldn't go at odds with the elite, right? As in, if you have a very confrontational approach to politics, there will be a backlash and you will lose. So therefore, they're arguing we will offer solutions such as nuclear or these BECCS that will deal with the climate crisis, but it won't affect anything else. It won't affect the rest of capitalist society. It won't really challenge people in other ways, and we can still have big cars and big houses and all that, right? And that's their wager. But the thing we say in the book is, they will lose because neoliberals, they don't want even to have like a big infrastructure project such as nuclear power, because geoengineering is going to be much cheaper. So and also these environmentalists, they're ignoring the fact that capitalism is what's causing these environmental crises. So having this kind of elite pact is a mistake, because it demobilizes their base, while it will never be adopted, right? To actually, if some people want to build something like close to 4,000 reactors over the next generation, and that's just not gonna happen. So I'm trying to lay out the terrain basically of how mainstream environmentalists, neoliberals, and then kind of what we're proposing are up to.
Yeah, thanks for this enormous question, Jan. It's huge. So I'll just add a little bit on what Troy was saying. So for one thing, in terms of the cause of the environmental crisis, one thing that we wanted to do in the book was to try and separate out a few puzzles. One is that the environmental crisis is accelerating and has gotten a lot worse recently in the sort of neoliberal era of capitalism, as Jan was saying earlier. So for example, since 1990, over half of all anthropogenic carbon emissions have happened. The Industrial Revolution was a long time ago, but that's sort of the rate at which we're going right now. And almost all of the deforestation of the Amazon has happened since 1990. So clearly there's this sort of change here. But the environmental crisis, as Troy was pointing out, is very old. And you could even say, in some sense, it's as old as we talk about briefly in the first chapter of the book, as animal husbandry itself, because we talk about in the book that disease, like a sort of pandemic style disease like influenza, smallpox, measles, all those diseases emerged less than 10,000 years ago from close contact between humans and livestock. And you can compare this to diseases among the indigenous nations of the Americas prior to colonization. So even though there were very complex and large societies in the Americas, there was very little disease because there wasn't much animal husbandry. So when colonization happens, the disease vectors go one direction, right? So clearly the environmental crisis has been around for a while. It's gotten worse recently. Why has it gotten worse recently? And this is what Troy was talking about with the automatic subject of capital. We make an argument in the book that I don't think we should really go into for this question, but that, you know, humans are transforming nature to meet our ends. This has consequences if it's done unwisely or too great of an extent. But when capital takes over, that process becomes blind and is driven not by human decisions, human consciousness, but rather by market forces. So we can all be aware that the environmental crisis is getting worse. And that could even be the CEO of a company and be aware that the environmental crisis is getting worse. But I'm compelled by market forces to act in a way that is maybe contrary to what my conscious will might be. So that's one addition I'd add. And then to the environmentalist question. So there's these sort of piecemeal solutions that are offered to the climate crisis, and they're unsatisfying in various ways. So for example, nuclear power, as Stroh is pointing out, I mean, it's longstanding been criticized by the environmental movement for its lack of safety, you know, what do you do with the waste, all those things. It's also a very expensive form of power. It takes a very long time to build a new nuclear plant. But there are some environmentalists out there who want to build a lot of new nuclear plants to help decarbonize the energy system without running into some of these problems of land use that we were talking about earlier. And because nuclear power can run 24/7, it's not reliant on the sun or the wind, intermittent flows. It's reliant on stocks of uranium or other radioactive elements. But it has these problems of cost. So under capitalism, it's not going to be as favored. It has problems of build time. And then once you build it, you only are able to use it for the electricity sector. And as we point out in the book, electricity is maybe 30% of total power use. So you don't actually help the transportation and industrial sectors. So it's not even the solution that it's sometimes made out to be, that if somehow we built all these nuclear plants, all of a sudden we'd be much better. So it's like a lack of this whole conceptual whole that we're talking about. And then I'll talk very briefly about bioenergy with carbon capture and storage, because I think it's very illustrative. And it's something that I don't think people hear about very much. And so what this is a proposed power source, which would be you grow a plantation of trees, you cut the trees down, you burn them for fuel, you capture the carbon emitted when you burn the trees, and you bury that carbon underground, sort of like inverse, mining for oil. And the argument here is that the trees take up carbon as they grow. So when you capture the carbon and bury it, you've removed carbon from the atmosphere. It's carbon negative energy source. This shows up in tons of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change models. So if you've heard of these IPCC models, to help us, address climate change in the future, it would be really great if, according to these models, if we built, 1, maybe 2 India's worth of these tree plantations, so that we can really get a lot of negative emissions going. But it's important to note that this is sort of an artifact of modeling. Like if you have a computer model and you want to solve this climate problem, and you don't want to maybe ask anyone to give anything up, or you don't want to model transformation of the economic system, well, then the computer is going to come up with this because it allows you to put a big negative number into the model, and then things work out nicely. But it's sort of clear that this is not going to work out because it's very expensive. That's a huge amount of land. And if you have animal agriculture that you're not confronting, it's sort of like, where are you going to put these plantations? You might have to just cut down the rainforest or something and build them there, which, at that point, you might be emitting more than you help. So that's just some of the sort of blinkered thought that we sort of criticize in the book. Yeah.
Great. Yeah. So I'm in things like this, I'm never sure how much of the book I'm allowed to spoil. So the reason I asked that question is because you've got this whole introduction, which is sort of a look back from a 2047, where it's exactly these kinds of logics and solutions you've just described that have been implemented and have failed, right? So you're counterposing your vision to this vision. So if you have this idea that markets will, what I would suggest is a faulty idea that markets will optimally allocate resource use, and that somehow if we just create the right market incentives and sort of commodify the right things, including things like aspects of nature itself. We can get away with the climate crisis. You clearly don't agree with this idea. And what you proposed instead as the basis for Half-Earth Socialism is planning, is highly complex planning of resource use, of things like land, like energy generation, like the type of crops that are grown and consumed through agriculture. And so I'd like you to delve into this idea of planning and how planning is, which you suggest is sort of a more functional approach to resource use and to creating, I suppose, I don't know what words you'd want to use, a greener, a more sustainable, a more eco-socialist planet. But ideally, given that it's such an interesting part of the story, I'd like you to get there through this sort of intellectual protagonist in the book. So on the book, when you talk about planning, you draw a lot on this relatively little known Austrian named Otto. I'm going to butcher this last name, much as my last name gets butchered, Neurath. So I was hoping you could tell us and tell the listeners and the viewers who Otto was and how you draw on his ideas to build your broader idea of planning as the basis for Half-Earth Socialism.
I'll start, and then Drew, please jump in. Yeah. So Neurath is how you pronounce his name. It looks like Neurath, but it's Neurath. He is quite the figure. I mean, I think I don't know how we really discovered him, but again, maybe reading Cottrell and Cockshott, I don't know why, but yeah. So who are some other socialist theorists from like the 90s. And what Neurath does that's really interesting is that he is very typical as a pre-World War I Viennese intellectual, where he kind of is just very good at everything. I mean, one of these polymaths that don't really exist anymore. He was an important philosopher. He was an economist. He was a curator. He was interested in graphic design. He was organizing this like gigantic encyclopedic project for, what was it called? Do you remember, Drew? It's like the encyclopedia of all knowledge of some sort, because he wanted to bridge the sciences and social sciences to create a single kind of knowledge. And he was doing all this kind of stuff. And he got his start studying ancient Egypt and the economics of ancient Egypt. And then he went to the Balkans for the Balkan Wars, which preceded World War I. And he studied how war planning worked. And what he discovered is that during a war, the market doesn't work very well. There's scarcity, there's problems with transmitting information. You have certain needs you have to meet very quickly. Otherwise you lose the war, and therefore planning becomes really important. And that is something that he was already interested in, because ancient Egypt didn't have money, but they could still carry out very complex tasks such as building pyramids, right? And then he gets hired by the Austrian War Ministry in World War I, because he has worked on war planning before. And soon after the war is over, he's hired by the socialists to run the Bavarian Soviet Republic, which is a short-lived socialist experiment in Munich and around in Bavaria, 1919. And he's hired as their central planner because he has so much experience as a planner, right? And then he writes his memorandum where he talks about socialism is about the conscious control of the economy, where people will decide amongst themselves what to do, what kind of production do they want, how many schools, how many hospitals, and they have to decide about the trade-offs between a set of total plans. And that's what socialism is. And that was a nice definition, because I think, again, with Drew and I, we weren't sure what socialism was. And I think this idea of socialism being the conscious control of the economy is satisfying in lots of ways, because you get away from the problem of markets and the problem of capital being this kind of blind force that is choosing what we are investing in, what we're buying and selling and all that, even if the outcome is not a good one, if we're destroying the planet. And then it also clears a way to think about socialist democracy, which is another huge problem, I think, for left-wing thinkers, where it's not clear what democracy is under socialism, because can it be simply bourgeois democracy? But how can that happen when capitalism is predicated on the separation between the political and the economic? So if you try to bring where, I mean, you have basically citizens who have universal, equal rights in the political sphere, like we're all citizens, bill of right to one vote and all that. And then the economic sphere, it's all about inequality, right? And coercion. And I mean, obviously bosses could fire workers and have this kind of power that citizens don't have. So, and that separation is important for democracy to function in a capitalist society. So what is democracy when you don't have that separation, right? And him saying that if we can actually have total plans and we will decide upon them as a society, and then we can start to carry them out. So that was a nice definition. So he writes this in 1919, and then the neoliberals attack him. So neoliberalism doesn't really exist as an ideology yet, but it is through their engagement with Neurath and then later some other socialist thinkers that neoliberalism exists. And neoliberalism has to form itself in the mirror image of Neurath, especially, where they have to say, if socialism is conscious control of the economy, then neoliberalism is the belief that markets are impossible to know and therefore cannot be controlled. And therefore, conscious control is impossible because of the problem of knowledge. You cannot know what's happening in the market. So this, and again, I was saying earlier, it's important, we believe, for the left to engage with neoliberalism. And this is going back to a long tradition of the left and right arguing with each other. I mean, one could go back to Marx or perhaps earlier, where Marx is reading classical political economy and writing his critique of it, right? And that's how Marxism emerges, from this engagement with liberal economics. And then similarly, neoliberals are engaging with socialists, and that's how neoliberalism emerges. So we believe that whatever we think of socialism now, it might be helpful for us to engage with our enemies and have another generative relationship. And not that this is like a relationship that's not a hostile one. I mean, neoliberals are quite happy to kill socialists. I mean, for example, we write about the Chilean experiment in socialism in the 70s, and that coup was carried out by a student of Milton Friedman's, right? So this is a very personal animosity, but we think it's useful to engage with that. So that's more or less, what Neurath does lots of other things. He's such an interesting guy. I'll say one last thing is, if you ask me about Neurath, I can talk for a long time. Neurath had a beautiful, what's beautiful about his work is he worked in so many different spheres, but they all were connected in a way, right? So they all are, like his work in the philosophy of science versus, economics versus his work as a planner or his political work are all connected. And so in his philosophy of science, he's saying there's no objective truth in science. Like, science is always going to be an imperfect model of reality, and we cannot know reality, right? And he uses the metaphor of the ship. So scientists are like sailors on a ship who are constantly remaking their ship, and they're above this ocean where there's nothing beneath them. There's nothing grounding them. It's just ocean all the way down, right? And that's just as good as it's going to get. And similarly, he thinks that he doesn't believe in technocracy, right? Because he has this belief that experts are basically doing the best they can, but also he has a belief that you can teach people quite a lot, right? He doesn't want to think that you have an expert caste that controls society. Instead, he was engaged with graphic design in terms of trying to teach the working class of Austria what was the economy. And he did this through isotype, where people could see what the economy looked like and visualize the economy. And that's related to his idea of conscious control of the economy. And which of course was terrifying for neoliberals. So this is a very long-winded answer, but we think by looking at Neurath, we can begin to think about certain things. He lacked certain, which I'm sure Drew can talk about, he lacked certain ways to implement his plans, and he wasn't an environmentalist. But so we're going to be building on something, but he lays the foundation for us.
Yeah, I'll just add that Neurath has a very beautiful idea called pseudo-rationality, is what he calls it. And he argues that if you have an economy that's based on a single metric, such as profit, where your people are optimizing according to such a metric, then you're going to make pseudo-rational decisions. Things that look rational, like you make a cost-benefit analysis, you tally up costs, you tally up everything, and then you can kind of make a choice based on that. You can argue for it. It looks rational, but it can lead to crazy outcomes. For example, we have plans out there. Governments and fossil fuel companies have already published plans to continue to expand fossil fuel extraction, counter to Paris Agreement things. So you signed the Paris Agreement, but your plans to extract already far exceed your Paris Agreement commitments. And this is because we already have all this fossil fuel infrastructure. There's trillions of dollars of these things underground. It's very expensive to get rid of it because it has more useful life left. On the balance sheet, it's pretty irrational to get rid of fossil fuels, right? Like, it's not profitable. It's extremely unprofitable, right? But that's not rational. That's not a rational thing to do, because we know that fossil fuel use has to stop as quickly as possible, and there can be no new fossil fuel infrastructure. That's sort of the IPC things from a few years ago. So this is a nice idea from Neurath in terms of, you have to think of the economy in these concrete terms, in terms of concrete reality. You can't just reduce it to this one metric. It's going to lead to bad outcomes. So we kind of run from there in the book to kind of think about the concrete trade-offs between these different decisions that we're making. Like, what are their consequences in terms of in terms of designing an energy system? What matters is not so much what it costs, but what are its material characteristics. Like, is it a fuel? Can it go into equipment that we have? Is it electricity? Do we have the lines for it? How is this electricity generated? Is it intermittent? What kinds of storage technologies do we have to build? What matters is those very brute facts, not so much profitability. So when we're designing our thoughts about how to plan the future, we need to think about these sorts of concrete trade-offs and how to kind of govern them in a way that's democratic and truly rational, as in we can decide together what sorts of sacrifices we're willing to make, what sort of lives we want to live, and then we can work out how to make that happen with technologies we have, or what technologies we need to deploy to make those choices.
Okay, so yeah, thank you so much for those very rich answers, and I just want to pick up from there to ask not so much offer pushback, but to ask a question about the on the ground pragmatics of making this happen. So I think one of the biggest tensions here is between, on the one hand, something like democratic flourishing, and on the other hand, limited resources. And on the other hand, this question of wanting democratic participation, something like a true holistic democratic participation. But on the other hand, the need for experts who understand how to plan things. And so there's these sort of tensions between like general flourishing and the notion of sacrifice, which you've mentioned a few times. And then on the other hand, this idea of like expert technocracy, of sort of optimally using limited resources without engaging in sort of self-destructive pseudo-rationality on one hand, and on the other, this appeal to democracy and broad democratic participation. So I'm wondering if you could talk through the pragmatics of these tensions. So on the one hand, if you want to set aside half the Earth for global flourishing, what if there are constituencies in this future eco-socialist society who don't want that? And as an aside, of course, one of the big critiques of the Half-Earth proposal is the idea that it sort of runs roughshod over the interests of people who may be living happily in the places from which they would be potentially removed to create a Half-Earth. So that's point one. And then point two, what does democratic participation in planning look like if you have quite strictly delimited limits on resource use on the one hand, and the need for quite comprehensive expertise on the other to actually, make the economy run within these limits? So I was wondering if you could speak through these tensions.
Yeah, no, you're getting right to the heart of the challenge here. So I'll start by talking a little bit about the idea that we have this idea that, at a broad or a global level, ideally, or maybe a smaller level at first, you would have conversations about the general contours of what the limits are, for example. So science can help us think about what limits might be reasonable, or what the consequences might be of emitting a certain amount of carbon, or of taking a certain amount of land from nature. But it can't tell us, like, you should take X amount, half or whatever. That's a conversation based on values about incommensurate trade-offs. So we kind of imagine that you would have some sort of debate about these sort of broad contours, very broadly sketched at this large scale, and then whatever we decide, how that looks in practice would be implemented in, a kind of a nested system, right, where you would have more and more local levels kind of deciding what that looks, practically, based on in fitting with this sort of global decision. This is kind of getting at the fact that the environmental crisis is global, right? Like what we emit, what I emit will affect someone else very far away. So I can't just do whatever I want. I should be constrained by something that we decide together. But we don't want that to be too kind of imposed from on high. It should be decided as much as possible at those local levels within those broader constraints. So that's sort of what we sketch a little bit in the book. And there's kind of not enough time really to get into too much of the concretes. We propose some algorithms, like real algorithms and technologies, both past and present, that could be useful in empowering this sort of democracy. But I think we don't have enough time to go into that too much. But that's sort of the vision there. And then on the point about, expert technocracy versus democracy, that's a real challenge. And Neurath's way of handling this was public education, which Troy was talking about with the isotype language. And we kind of imagine a little bit that some of the technologies we're proposing to help, make these plans could be made transparent, and maybe people can participate in them in that way, and then also participate in their own kind of governance of how things are implemented near them. And the last thing I'll say before I let Troy go on for this is on the point of the problem of the half-Earth, displacing people. So we talk in the book about how biodiversity is higher, for example, on indigenous managed lands than in nature preserves in many cases. So that might include things like indigenous sovereignty over indigenous lands in a socialist half-Earth that maybe has not been thought about as much in conservative conservation. So there's no need for those sorts of conflicts, but there may be conflicts, and that's the sort of thing where we'll have to try and use negotiation, use conversations at these more local levels to figure out how to implement these things in practice. But those conflicts will be there, and they're real, and they'll have to be negotiated and resolved. And I don't know if we have a general global answer for how those negotiations would go. Troy, I don't know if you have anything to add.
Yeah, I mean, I know we're running out of time, so I'll try to be quick. But I mean, so we're basically saying to people, because there's Drew saying conflicts are real. And I think this is a bit strange when you have Marxists who are incredible critics of capitalism, but when they talk about socialism, it becomes very naive, right? Suddenly, like, everyone will just do what they want to do, and there'll be no, we won't disagree with each other, and things will be fine, and somehow it will work out. I mean, this is again one reason why one thing we're writing against. And then again, like I read neoliberal stuff all the time for my day job as someone who's a historian of neoliberalism. And they have a very sophisticated sense of what property is, right? And they, as in, property for them is the right to cause harms to other people. And then this is, and that could just be as simple as what property is, as in if you own something, you're excluding other people from it, right? That's the most basic kind of harm. But also, if you're owning something, then maybe it will emit a certain noise, or maybe some kind of chemical of some sort, and that will affect other people. And then we have to, as a society, balance what's the amount of harm we're willing to have amongst ourselves, right? As in, to have an economy that has no harms, right? I mean, this doesn't make any sense. I mean, as in, like, we need to mine a lot of stuff to build millions of wind turbines and build solar panels and all that. That will cause some harms. The question is, how do we deal with those harms? And then So I think, I guess I'm saying, also like, if we're saying we want to prevent extinction, and there's lots of people who are, making lots of money or, and making their living from cutting down the rainforest in Amazon to, have more soy and pastures for beef and selling that. Well, that has to stop, right? So I mean, like these things are either or, right? And again, the book is all about trade-offs. So like either do we want to change how these people live, or do we want to stop extinctions? But we have to make a choice there. So I think you're very right that this will be conflictual in lots of ways, because we are going to politicize lots of things. But then the other thing I would say, and kind of bargain of the book, is that most people are not vegan Marxists, right? That's a tiny niche of a niche. So, but the idea is that if we have conscious control of the economy and people can see what those trade-offs are, then maybe they're more willing to change something. So if you tell people, okay, like, do you want to have geoengineering, and do you want to have mass extinction, or do you want to have perhaps safer ways of afforestation to sequester carbon and stop mass extinction, and also prevent new zoonotic diseases from emerging, but it's going to cost you meat, right? Or do you want to have lots of biofuels, or gigantic areas for renewables, or should we limit our energy production that will save land? And I think by seeing the economy as a whole, we can have more intelligent conversations. And people who are skeptical of veganism or animal rights or whatever it is, they can start seeing that makes a lot more sense, rather than the 2% of people who are currently vegetarian.
So I see Stephen has logged in, perhaps with questions from the audience. But I do have sort of one question that I was hoping to ask to bring this home and bring this full circle. I mean, so what you've just said is, so in a sense, what's really fascinating about this book is that it's this highly utopian vision, but it's very much rooted in real resource limits, real sort of pragmatics of planning. So what you call, I think, scientific utopianism, which is a very interesting term. So unlike, for instance, the eco-modernists who think we can sort of decouple environmental damage from, infinite growth, or unlike the luxury space communism, capitalism will fall and we'll all just, have jets and cars and lab-grown meat and nuclear power. You push against that. So in a sense, it's like a very grounded utopianism. But the question that I want to ask about utopian thinking is your use of fiction in the book. And I was wondering if you could briefly talk about this, because the book ends with, and again, I don't want to spoil anything because I think people should go buy and read the book, but your book ends with this quite long sort of fictionalized vision of this future of yours. And so I suppose it's a general question, but what is the role of sort of in shaping sort of greener politics, of utopia, of fiction, of imagination, and how do those relate to these extremely like algorithmic plans that you're also pushing for? But I'll also ask, I know I didn't keep it brief with that question, but I'll ask that you keep it a little bit brief given time constraints, please.
Drew's going to go, but I just want to say your questions are so good. Oh man. Okay, Drew.
Yeah, so we are big fans of science fiction and utopian fiction. So we're inspired by William Morris, who has a wonderful book called News from Nowhere, which I think the audience here would all really love, from 1890, which is like an eco-socialism future. And we love Ursula Le Guin, The Dispossessed, and some of her other books. And so, this is a great way of opening minds up to the future. And so we use fiction to help make things concrete. We're very abstract in a lot of the book, even as we're using hard numbers. But what does that look like? What does that feel like? Fiction is a great way of exploring that. Video games are also a great way of exploring this sort of thing. So we have a video game that comes with the book that'll be out in a couple of weeks at the website half.earth. So I'm just going to throw that in there too. But things like fiction and video games are ways of immersing yourself in a way that's not just numbers, not just analytic thought, but allows you to feel things, see trade-offs, play, and open your mind up to a system beyond what we have right now. So that's why we're big fans.
I think it's funny that you say it's like a contradiction, but the one who wrote the most, I guess, grounded scientific stuff and the fiction was both Drew. So I mean, it wasn't me. And I think, as we were saying about Neurath, the idea of like visualizing the future is so important. I think fiction does that really well. But I feel like we should wrap. Are we running out of time, Stephen? No,
I mean, we could go all day if you want, but that you actually, Jan, you actually touched on one of the audience questions was, which utopian fiction, which novels inspired you or would you recommend? And a few of those, obviously, you just did. The other big question, I'm going to kind of fold this in to a personal question as well, because someone asked, how far do you think we are from Half-Earth model? And I would addend to that, like, how optimistic are you about a plan like this or plans like this? Because one of the things that I really admire about the book is exactly that. It's utopian in its thinking and it's broad and it's in some ways idealistic, but it's really alive to the complications of how you would go about something like this. And I know that's not an easy set of questions to answer briefly, but how far are we and how far are we physically and how far are we sort of culturally, economically?
We're so far
from a model.
We're incredibly far. So, I mean, in terms of like the easy, like the smaller question, a more practical question, like how far are we in terms of creating the half-Earth? Around 50% of land is protected. Probably 5% of that is not protected very well. I mean, lots of national parks still have logging and other things in them. So maybe 10% is well protected. And then the ocean is barely protected at all. There's like different estimates, but it's around like 2% or something like that. And I think, people don't care enough about the ocean, either in terms of carbon sequestration, because I mean, the sea grass and kelp forests and even having lots of fish and whales and things like that is a huge part of the carbon cycle that barely gets mentioned, and it's still not that much research in it. The estimates for blue carbon are very rough still compared to other works. So we have a huge range to go, and to get from like 10% to 50%. And it's probably not going to happen within a capitalist society. So a lot of conservationists, E.O. Wilson, worked a lot with philanthropists and just having like people like Ted Turner and other billionaires just like buy up a lot of land, and they would just turn that land usually into special kind of exotic, ranches to like sell bison meat. Or, this is a big thing also in Europe where I live, where they actually have like an auroch. It's a cow that's very close to an extinct auroch, and then they'll rewild an area, that put the auroch in, and then they'll sell that meat, and that's rewilding. So we want to get to we're very far away, because I think if you're dependent on philanthropists to achieve this, and you try to do that as a profitable venture, and then you're not politicizing anything or thinking about the big picture, it's just not gonna happen. In terms of like your other question, like how far are we from creating any kind of utopia? We're extremely far away, because I mean, I think a lot of environmentalists and socialists and other progressives, they think that they're not doing so badly on the political front. Like, they know they're losing, right? Whether it's for like seats on the Supreme Court or winning elections or whatever it is. But I think they're just not aware how well organized the right, especially neoliberals, are, and how ruthless they are. I think that, and by studying the neoliberals, I really get to see like how important it is to really think through your beliefs. So then you believe in your beliefs, and also you have a wide range of policies, and you know what to do when you take power. Because even when people take power, they're still not able to really do anything. So I think we're very far away. But hopefully this book contributes to a discussion where we begin to think about that more seriously.
Yeah, I'll just add that there's I do activism for energy democracy and environmental eco-socialism, in my spare time. And it's the experience of writing this book, which is so utopian, and then the practical difficulties of getting anything done through Massachusetts State House, which is where I am, is just the most insane cognitive dissonance. So how we get from this sort of imagination to like that sort of practical like movement power building it's a hard way, it's a long way. If we had the answer, we would have written it in the book. So I guess that's our answer to the to the question there. But I guess it's just, we'll keep going because we kind of have to. But I am sort of optimistic. I think that we can do things. I think that we can build power. I think that we can imagine a new world. But it's hard to imagine how it would work in practice, I guess.
Yeah, well, I do think it's through work like this that we can move ourselves in that direction. Hopefully not before it's too late, if that's still possible. Well, thank you all so much for this conversation today. I really hope that people find the book and kind of think through these problems along with you. It's an important piece of literature, and it is that it's not just a scientific, like Jan, as you mentioned, like the fiction was some of the best parts of the book for me. I really enjoyed those parts and thinking through imaginatively what a better world would look like. So thank you, Troy and Drew, for bringing us into the world, and Jan for the insightful, thoughtful questions today. We'll get this recording up on YouTube so we can share it more broadly as well. And I hope everybody enjoys the rest of the afternoon or evening. And let's keep fighting for a better world. Thank you both, and everyone. We'll see you next time.
Thank you. Bye.
Thanks.